Today's recipe calls for a ton of butter. I'm going to show you how to make a cake that pretends to be something it's not, also known as coffee cake. This recipe is really easy and perfect for any novice baker out there. So with that said, let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is preheat our oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit while we get our cake ready. The next thing we're going to do is make the center filling to our coffee cake. So in a small bowl, you're going to add half a cup of packed light brown sugar. Then feel free to break it up either with your hands or a whisk. Breaking it up will help make it easier to incorporate the brown sugar with the rest of our ingredients. The next thing we're going to add to our bowl is half a cup of all-purpose flour and 1 tablespoon of ground cinnamon. We're going to sift these ingredients into our brown sugar. This will help ensure that we don't end up with clumps of flour in our center filling of our coffee cake, and this also helps mix the flour and cinnamon together a little bit easier as well. Now that you have your flour and cinnamon in your bowl, you're going to grab a whisk and you're going to lightly whisk your face off to bring these two ingredients together with our brown sugar. You want to ensure that everything is well mixed together. This way we end up with a nice and even filling for our coffee cake. And you can ditch the whisk and also use your little hands to mix everything together as well. You want to ensure that you break up any of the brown sugar clumps so everything is the same texture. The next thing we're going to add to our bowl is 3 tablespoons of unsalted room temperature butter. You can cut this into cubes to make your life a little bit easier, or you can just break it off into small pieces like I did. And now you're going to start pinching the brown sugar, flour, cinnamon, and butter together to make a nice crumbly mixture. You can use a pastry cutter for this, or you can also use a fork, or you can get in there nice and deep like and use your little fingies to pinch everything together. And it doesn't hurt to get a little bit messy every now and then in the kitchen. In the end, it should look and feel like wet sand. It should look something sort of like this. Once you have that done, set that aside so we can move on to the next step. The next thing we're going to do in a large mixing bowl is make the topping for our coffee cake. First thing you're going to add to your bowl is a half a cup of packed light brown sugar. And like we did before, we're going to break that up so it's easier to mix in with the rest of our ingredients. Next, we're going to add 3/4 cup of all-purpose flour, 1 tablespoon of ground cinnamon. Then we're going to sift these two ingredients into our brown sugar. Next thing we're going to do is add 5 tablespoons of room temperature unsalted butter to our bowl. This time I cubed it up and it did make it a lot easier. Then I added about half of our butter in and then cut that in. This will help ensure that the first set of butter gets cut in and mixed in really well before we add the rest of the butter. And this go around I used the brass knuckles of the baking world, also known as the pastry cutter. This definitely helps speed up the process, but it isn't a must. Keep cutting in the butter until you have nothing left to cut in. Then you want to stop and periodically clean off your pastry cutter or a fork if you're using one, because the mixture starts to gum up and stick to our pastry cutter. And you want to knock that loose to ensure that it gets well mixed in to the rest of our topping for our coffee cake. In the end, it should have a few crumbs and be slightly crummy, but mostly have the consistency of flour and should look something like this. The next thing we're going to do is start to make our cake batter. We're going to mix all of our dry ingredients together first. So in a separate bowl, you're going to add 2 cups of all-purpose flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, and 1/4 teaspoon of sea salt. And we're going to sift all of these ingredients together. This is important because we want a smooth batter. This way it'll prevent any clumps of flour in our cake. Now that you have all of your ingredients sifted together, you're going to lightly whisk your face off to ensure everything gets well and mixed together before we move on to the next step. The next thing we're going to do is start on our wet ingredients. So in a stand mixer with a paddle attachment or even a hand mixer, whichever you have, you're going to add 1 stick of room temperature unsalted butter to your bowl. And you're going to lightly break that up. This way it'll be easier to cream together with our sugar. And hopefully you're not counting calories because there's a ton of butter in this recipe. Then before we add the sugar to our bowl, you want to give your bowl a quick scrapey scrape, especially the paddle attachment because the butter likes to stick to that. This will help ensure that it's easier for the sugar and butter to mix well together. Now that we have our butter broken up a bit, we're going to add 3/4 cup of granulated sugar to our mixing bowl. You can leave your mixer running or you can also turn it off if you choose. I'd turn mine down to low and add my sugar, then I'll turn it back up to about a medium speed. We're going to cream our butter and sugar together for about 4 to 5 minutes or until our butter becomes nice and fluffy and airy and looks opaque in color.
And then about halfway through that 4 to 5 minutes, you're going to stop and give your bowl a good scrape down. You really want to ensure that you scrape the bottom of your stand mixer bowl. Stuff is notorious for sticking to the bottom of the bowl. That's just the way they're designed. So you want to ensure that you get that bottom really well. Once you have it a nice scrapey scrape, you're going to turn your mixer back on and keep mixing it to cream the butter and sugar together. Next, we're going to add 1 whole egg and some vanilla extract to our mixing bowl. But first, we're going to knock off the butter from our paddle attachment. The next thing we're going to add to our mixing bowl is 1 large room temperature egg. It's best to crack your egg in a separate container. This way, if you accidentally get some eggshell in your egg, you can pick it out a lot easier in that separate bowl instead of your batter bowl. And the next thing we're going to add is 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. And you can play around with the extracts and do different flavors if you choose. Now that we have our egg and vanilla extract in our bowl, we're going to turn our mixer back on and mix all of these ingredients together on medium to high speed. We're going to mix this until our egg is really well incorporated with our butter and sugar. And you want to periodically stop and scrape everything down just because the butter sticks to the side of our bowl and doesn't get well mixed with our egg. Now that our egg is really well mixed together with our butter and sugar, we're going to turn our mixer to low speed and start to add half of our dry ingredient mixture to our mixing bowl. It's best to turn your mixer down to low. If you have it on too high, then you're going to make a gigantic flour mess. Once it's decently incorporated, you can turn the speed back up to about medium and get that mixed in fairly well. You can tell that your flour is well mixed in. The dough should start taking the shape and look of a sugar cookie dough. After it looks like that, we're going to pour in 3/4 cup of milk. You can use any milk of your choice. I went with oat milk today, but any will work the same. You're going to turn your mixer on to low speed and slowly pour in your milk. This is when our batter really starts to take form of a cake. Now that you've given your bowl a good scraperoo, you're going to turn your mixer back on to low speed so we can add the rest of our dry ingredients. Now I always find it easier to slowly spoon in our dry ingredients into our mixing bowl. This makes it a whole lot easier so you don't end up with a giant flour bomb. Eventually you're going to pour it in and not use the spoon. And it's really important not to over mix your cake batter at this point. You want to mix everything together until you can't see any flour and go ahead and stop right after that. Over mixing it will activate the gluten protein, which in turn will make our cake too dense and will end up with something that's a little too hard and could potentially be dry. We're looking for something that's nice and airy and fluffy and light, just like our apple cider donut batter. Now that everything is nice and well mixed together and our batter is super smooth and airy, we're going to take everything off of our stand mixer and clean off our paddle attachment. You can use your rubber spatula for this. I find it to be a whole lot easier to use my fingies, and this is what your cake batter should look like, is something like this. Next, you're going to heavily grease a 9x9 baking dish. You can use cooking spray for this, but I opted to use some more butter because why not? Keep the butter theme going, and the butter will add more fat, which is more flavor, of course. You really want to grease your pan really well. You want to ensure that you grease the corners on all 4 sides and the sides of your pan as well. Next, to our well-greased pan, we're going to add half of our cake batter to our pan and do your best to get about half in there. This will help ensure that the center filling is halfway through our cake. Once you get your batter into your pan, you're going to level it out with a rubber spatula and just smooth it out as best as possible and really ensure that you get the batter in all 4 of your corners. And it's best to keep turning your pan and spreading out your batter with your rubber spatula. Now that you have your cake batter all smoothed out in your pan, we're going to add the crumble filling right on top of our cake batter. And of course, you want to ensure that you get in all 4 corners of your pan and on the edges of your cake batter as well. In the end, you should end up with a nice even layer of crumble. You can lightly press it in to your cake batter as well. Now that you have all the crumble filling added to your pan, we're going to add the rest of our cake batter right on top of our crumble filling. Of course, give your bowl a good scrape down. This way we're not wasting any food and it's a lot easier to clean later on. And it's best to rinse your batter bowl right away. This will help prevent any of the batter from getting crusty and hard, making it harder to clean later on. Now that you have the rest of your batter in your pan, you're going to do your best to carefully smooth out the top batter, not to disturb the center crumble in our cake. I found this to be super challenging, and I honestly don't know what the best way to do this is, since I'm a novice baker. The best method I found though was to smooth out your batter from edge to edge. And once you get to the edge, scrape off your spatula on the side of your pan. This seemed to work fairly well, and you don't want to really lift your spatula up on your crumble. This will of course in turn pick up the crumble and start to make your cake look fairly ugly, but in the end it's not that big of a deal. So do your best to smooth it out as best as possible. The cake batter and the crumble got mixed up just a little bit and it looks a little ugly, but oh well, in the end we're gonna cover it anyways. Now that you have the last bit of your batter smoothed out, we're gonna add the topping that we made earlier to our pan. And you want to ensure that you hit all four corners of your pan with the topping and the edges of your pan as well. And I found what helps to ensure that everything gets covered is to lightly shake your pan. This will help move around the cake topping, ensuring that everything gets covered. Now that you've added all your topping to your pan, you're gonna lightly press on the cake topping to help make sure that it adheres to your cake batter. Now that our cake is done, we're gonna clean off the edges of our pan with a paper towel. This will help ensure that none of the cake batter that's on the side of our pan will burn and make our house smell. And it'll be a lot easier to clean later instead of that stuff burning on and getting all crusty and gross. Now that our cake is done and our pan is cleaned up, we're gonna go ahead and throw it in our preheated oven. Then we're gonna throw our cake on the middle rack of our oven to bake. Now that our cake is in the oven, we're gonna set a timer for 45 minutes. You're gonna bake your cake for 45 to 50 minutes. It all depends on how hot your oven runs and where you live. I found 45 minutes to work the best for me, so you may start with that and go longer if you need to. Now that our timer has gone off, we'll pull our cake out of the oven to check to see if it's done. Then once your cake is out of the oven, you're gonna throw it on a cooling rack and grab a toothpick and you're gonna poke the center of your cake, and if it comes out clean, then you know it's done. Hot damn! Then we'll let our cake cool down for about 15 to 20 minutes before we cut into it. Now that your coffee cake has had some time to cool, you're gonna grab your favorite plate and a spatula, and you're gonna cut yourself a good size piece of coffee cake. And you can top your coffee cake with some homemade whipped cream or dust it with some powdered sugar, or you can eat it straight up just like I did. Then you're gonna grab your favorite coffee mug and pour yourself a good cup of coffee as well. And go ahead and dig in. Enjoy.
Alright, now that we got our cup of coffee and our coffee cake is done, let's give it the old tasteroo. Right off the bat though, looks super good. The top is nice and brown and crunchy and crumbly. Then that center filling is super defined in there, which I was kind of worried about, but it came out looking great. Overall, it looked super delicious, so let's give it a taste. Big old bite! So right off the bat, this thing is super buttery and delicious. Then the cinnamon in the middle filling shines through really well and adds a flavor profile to our cake. Then the sugar on top on our crumble got a little bit of a caramelization on it, which is super good and adds another flavor profile to it. Then the texture on it overall is super airy and fluffy, and you're gonna hate it. It's moist, but boohoo, you'll get over that. And then the crumble on top as well is nice and crunchy, which gives it the great texture to help round out the entire cake. And it's just super delicious and goes great with coffee. That's why it's called coffee cake, eh? Alright, that's it for today's video. This recipe is really easy, like I mentioned before. There's not a whole lot to it. And you can make this any which way possible. Add some sour cream, make it a sour cream coffee cake, or add some fresh blueberries, make it a blueberry coffee cake. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways, so use your imagination for that one. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video. Thanks for watching. I'm gonna go crush this pan of cake and a whole pot of coffee and get all jacked up on caffeine and sugar and maybe run like a land speed record and be like the fastest man alive. It'd be cool. So I'll let you know how that one goes. We'll see you on the next one. So if you're watching this right now and you're super cold and you don't know why, it's because you're in the fridge. The sugar on top, that baked, the crust. I don't know what I'm saying. Some sweetness, and then the crumble on top. Some of that sugar got crystallized. No, caramelized. Oh, check. I didn't mean to film. My hair is out of control.